They told the orphan his Quonset was worthless until he found a bunker beneath the floor. And what he discovered there didn't just change his future, it rewrote his entire past. If you've ever felt like the world has handed you nothing but scraps, stick around. This story is for you. And if it resonates, hit that subscribe button, because we're building a community here for people who know what it's like to fight for every inch. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to be a line item in the state budget. There was no cake, no party, just a cardboard box and the signature of a man I'd never met on a form that declared me officially, legally, on my own. My caseworker, Ms. Albright, stood in the doorway of my room at the group home, her expression a familiar blend of institutional fatigue and faint, flickering sympathy. She'd been my caseworker for the last 6 of my 12 years in the system. Her face, etched with the fine lines of 1,000 other forgotten kids, was the closest thing I had to a fixed point in my life. The room itself wasn't mine, it was just the space I'd occupied. The walls were cinder block painted a shade of beige that I called institutional sadness. The single window looked out onto a chain-link fence and the perpetually damp asphalt of the parking lot. I had my entire life packed into that one cardboard box. 3 changes of clothes, a worn paperback copy of a book about stars, a cracked photo of 2 people I was told were my parents, and a deep, abiding silence where a childhood was supposed to be. "Leo," Ms. Albright said, holding out a thick manila envelope. Her voice was flat, but not unkind. It was the voice of someone who had delivered this kind of news too many times. "Happy birthday." The words hung in the air, awkward and out of place. Birthdays in the system weren't celebrations, they were deadlines. This is it, the final paperwork. I took the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the bureaucracy that had defined my existence. Inside was my birth certificate, my Social Security card, and a check for $174, the remaining balance of my state-managed account. My severance package from a childhood I never really had. "There's one other thing," she said, shifting her weight. "Your grandfather's estate." I flinched. The word grandfather was a stone in my gut. I remembered him in flashes, the scent of sawdust and coffee, the low rumble of his voice, the rough texture of his hands. He'd taken me in for a year after my parents died, a brief island of stability in a sea of chaos. And then, one day, he was gone. He'd handed me over to the state, they told me, without a word of explanation. Abandoned me. The resentment was cold and hard and 12 years old. "He didn't have an estate," I said, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. "He had nothing." "Well, not exactly nothing," she corrected gently. She pulled another document from her briefcase. It was a deed, old and brittle at the creases. "He left you a piece of property out in Carbon County, Wyoming, a little over 5 acres. I stared at the paper. My name, Leo Vance, was typed neatly beside his, Arthur Vance. It felt like a name from a story, not my own. 5 acres. The words sounded immense, impossible. I'd spent my life in rooms measured in square feet. "A property?" I repeated, the word tasting strange. "What kind of property?" Ms. Albright sighed. This was the part she clearly didn't relish. "It's undeveloped land, mostly. There's a structure on it, a Quonset hut, the county records call it. It's been vacant for over a decade, since he left." She didn't say died. He'd died 2 years ago, a fact I'd learned from a form letter. I hadn't cried. You can't mourn a ghost. "There's a problem, Leo. There are back taxes owed. 12 years of them. It comes to about $4,700. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. Of course there was a catch. He hadn't left me a home. He'd left me a debt. A final, parting insult from the man who'd thrown me away. So I own a debt, I said. Great. Happy birthday to me. Not necessarily, she said, her professional calm kicking in. There's an offer. A company called Apex Development has been trying to acquire the surrounding parcels for years. They've had a standing offer on your grandfather's plot. They're offering $5,000. It would cover the taxes and leave you with about $300. It's not much, but it's a start. Better than nothing. She slid another paper across the desk, a formal offer, printed on heavy letterhead. It was a clean, simple solution. Sign the paper, take the few $100, and walk away. Erase the last trace of Arthur Vance from my life. It was the smart thing to do, the practical thing. It was what anyone would do. They say the hut is a tear-down, she added softly. Completely worthless, rusted through. The land is considered marginal grazing land. Honestly, Leo, they're probably overpaying just to consolidate the plots. Worthless. The word echoed in the beige room. A worthless structure on a worthless piece of land, left by a man who had decided I was worthless too. It was a perfect, miserable symmetry. I'll need your signature here, Ms. Albright said, pointing to a line. We can have the money wired to you by the end of the week. You can get a room, start looking for a job. I looked at the line. My signature. The final act of severing. For 12 years, I'd told myself a story about a boy who was unwanted, a boy who was left behind because he wasn't good enough. Signing that paper would make the story true. It would be the period at the end of a long, sad sentence. And every rational part of my brain, the part that had been trained by years of survival, screamed at me to sign. But then a different thought surfaced. A quiet, stubborn, and utterly illogical question. What if I just saw it first? What if, for the first time in my life, I didn't just take their word for it? The idea was terrifying. It meant trading the certainty of a few $100s for the absolute uncertainty of a bus ticket to the middle of nowhere. To a place I'd never been. To see a wreck I couldn't possibly fix. It was a stupid, romantic, and deeply irresponsible idea. It was the first real choice I had ever been able to make. I looked up from the paper, past Ms. Albright's tired face, and out the window at the gray, indifferent sky. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it filled the entire room. I'm not signing, not yet. Ms. Albright blinked, surprised. Leo, be realistic. What are you going to do? Go out there? You have less than $200. There's no power, no water. We're heading into winter. He left it to me, I said, my fingers closing around the old deed. I didn't know why I was doing it. It wasn't about hope. It was something closer to defiance. It was a refusal to let my story be written by a developer's offer and a caseworker's practical advice. I want to see it. She studied my face for a long moment, and for the first time, the professional mask cracked. I saw a flicker of something else, not pity, maybe respect, or maybe just the recognition of a familiar, hopeless brand of stubbornness. She sighed, a long, slow exhalation of air. Okay, Leo, she said, gathering her papers. Okay, it's your life now. And just like that, the door closed, and I was alone. Alone, with a cardboard box, a bus ticket to Wyoming, and the deed to a worthless piece of junk in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a future. But it was a direction. And for the first time in my life, it was one I had chosen myself. The bus ride was 3 days of my life I'll never get back. But it was also the first time I understood the sheer scale of the world. For 12 years, my world had been a series of rooms, hallways, and fenced-in yards. The country outside the grimy bus window was a revelation. It unspooled in endless miles of cornfields, then rolling hills, then vast open plains that seemed to stretch into the curvature of the earth. The sky got bigger, the towns got smaller. With every mile, the structured, supervised world I had known fell further behind, and a vast, intimidating freedom opened up ahead. I spent the time staring out the window, the crumpled deed in my pocket a constant crinkling reminder of my impulsive choice. I ate stale crackers and drank lukewarm water from a plastic bottle. At night, I'd lean my head against the vibrating glass and watch the constellations wheel overhead, the same ones from my tattered astronomy book. Out here, with no city lights to wash them out, they were brilliant and terrifyingly clear. They made me feel impossibly small. Was this a mistake? The question was a constant hum beneath the drone of the bus engine. I had a little over $100 left. What was I going to do when I got there? Live in a rusted-out shed with no heat in the middle of a Wyoming winter? The absurdity of it washed over me in waves, a cold tide of panic. I could have had almost $500. I could have gotten a room at a weekly rate motel, found a dishwashing job. I could have been safe. Instead, I was hurtling toward a ghost. The final leg of the journey was on a smaller regional bus that smelled of diesel and damp wool. The other passengers were mostly ranchers and roughnecks, men with calloused hands and faces weathered like old leather. They looked at my thin jacket and city sneakers with a kind of quiet, pitying curiosity. I was obviously not from around here. The bus dropped me off at a crossroads with a single, blinking yellow light. The town of Carbon Creek was, according to the sign, another 2 miles down the road. The address on the deed was just a rural route number. The bus driver, a heavy-set woman with a kind, tired face, looked at me in her rear-view mirror. "This is you, kid," she said. "You sure you know where you're going?" I nodded, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "Got a place out on Route 12. She squinted. "Route 12? Ain't much out there but sagebrush and Jack Henderson's old spread. And the Vance place. You ain't headed to the old Vance place, are you?" Her tone was laced with disbelief. "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. "That's it." She shook her head slowly. "Lord, child, nobody's been out there in years. Not since old Arthur passed." She paused, then seemed to think better of whatever she was going to say next. "Town's that way," she said, jerking a thumb down the road. "Diner's open till 8. You'll need supplies." Then the hydraulic doors hissed shut and the bus pulled away, leaving me in a cloud of dust and a profound, deafening silence. I stood there for a long time, my box in my hand, my breath pluming in the cold air. The sun was low in the sky, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of orange and purple. The wind was relentless, a living thing that whipped across the open plains, cutting through my thin jacket. It carried the scent of dust and something wild and clean, like pine needles and snow. I followed the faded asphalt road toward the town. Carbon Creek wasn't so much a town as a brief interruption in the landscape. There was a single main street with a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a bar with a flickering neon sign. I went into the hardware store first. It was warm inside, a chaotic cathedral of tools, pipes, and supplies. An old man with a magnificent white beard sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He looked up over his glasses as I came in. "Help you?" he asked. I'm not sure," I stammered, feeling foolish. "I'm staying out at the Vance place. I need supplies." The man put his paper down. The look on his face was the same one the bus driver had given me. "The Quonset hut? Son, you can't stay out there. We're expecting the first big snow any day now. That place ain't fit for man nor beast." "I just need to see it," I said. "It's mine." He sighed, rubbing his beard. "Arthur's grandkid, then. I heard he had one. Name's Dale." He stuck out a hand, and I shook it. His grip was like iron. "Look, I'm not going to tell you your business, but you'll need a good lantern, fuel, some heavy-duty trash bags, work gloves, and probably a pry bar. The door's likely rusted shut." He walked me through the aisles, pointing out what I'd need. He was practical, not sentimental. He didn't ask about my grandfather. He just seemed to accept the foolishness of my quest as a fact of life. I left the store with my wallet significantly lighter, and my box now burdened with a lantern, a fuel can, and a heavy steel pry bar. My last stop was the diner. I ordered a burger and fries and ate them slowly, savoring the warmth. It was probably the last hot meal I'd have for a while. The waitress, a woman about my mother's age if my mother had lived, kept refilling my coffee, her eyes full of unspoken questions. As I paid the bill, she leaned in. "You be careful out there, hun. That's a lonely place." I walked the last mile out of town as dusk settled, turning the world to shades of gray and blue. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, and then the gravel thinned to a dirt track. And then I saw it. Set back from the road, silhouetted against the darkening sky, was a long, curved shape like the back of a great metal whale beached on the plains. The Quonset hut. It was worse than I'd imagined. It was a monument to rust and neglect. Several panels were missing from the roof, leaving dark, gaping holes. The windows were either boarded up or shattered. A tangle of weeds and rusted metal junk littered the ground around it. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a ruin. A wave of despair, cold and sharp as the wind, washed over me. Ms. Albright was right. Dale at the hardware store was right. The bus driver was right. This was a mistake. I should have signed the paper. I stood there, the cold seeping into my bones, the weight of my $100 survival kit dragging me down. I could turn around. I could walk back to the road, stick out my thumb, and be gone before morning. No one would ever know. But I had come all this way. I had spent almost all my money. The thought of turning back now felt like a deeper kind of failure than staying. With a deep breath that felt like swallowing ice, I shifted the box in my arms, gripped the pry bar, and started walking toward the rusted metal shell that was, for better or worse, my home. The wind howled around the curved walls, sounding for all the world like a long, mournful sigh. The front door was a single wide sheet of corrugated metal, its edges fused to the frame by a decade of rust. There was no handle, just a padlock so corroded it looked like a lump of reddish-brown clay. The key Ms. Albright had given me, a small, simple brass key, was useless. It was for a lock that had long since surrendered to the elements. This was my first test. I wedged the tip of the pry bar into the seam between the door and the frame. I put my shoulder into it and pushed. Nothing. Just the groan of stressed metal and the scraping sound of rust on rust. I tried again, putting all my weight, all my frustration, all my fear into it. The bar bit deeper. I felt a slight give, a tiny, hopeful shift. I repositioned the bar, found a better angle, and heaved. With a screech that set my teeth on edge, a sound like the world tearing in half, the rusted lock shrieked and snapped. The door moved inward a few inches with a shudder. It was open, or, at least, ajar. I squeezed through the gap into the darkness within. The air inside was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of dust, decay, and the faint, musty scent of forgotten things. It was colder inside than out, the metal walls holding the chill like a tomb. I fumbled with the lantern Dale had sold me, my hands numb and clumsy. After a few tries, the wick caught, and a warm, golden light pushed back the oppressive dark. The circle of light revealed a cavernous space. The hut was bigger than I expected, maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, the corrugated walls curving up to a high, arched ceiling. But the space was filled with ghosts. Not literal ones, but the ghosts of a life abruptly stopped. A thick layer of dust covered everything, softening the edges of the junk-filled interior. There was a workbench running along one wall, cluttered with tools that were now just rust-red shapes. Sacks of what might have been seed or feed were slumped against the far wall, their contents long since spilled and spoiled. An old cast-iron wood stove stood in the center of the room, a rusty pipe snaking up toward one of the holes in the roof. In one corner, there was a makeshift living area, a cot with a rotted mattress, a small table, and a single wooden chair. This was where he had lived. This was the life he'd had after he sent me away. I walked slowly through the space, the lantern light throwing long, dancing shadows. I ran a gloved hand over the workbench, leaving a clean streak in the thick dust. I saw the faint outlines of where tools had once hung in neat rows. My grandfather, in the brief year I knew him, had been a man of order. Everything had a place. This chaos wasn't his style. This was the aftermath. This was what happens when a life is abandoned. My anger at him, the cold, familiar stone in my gut, began to dissolve, replaced by a profound and aching sadness. What had happened to him here? Why did he leave me only to end up in a place like this, alone? I set the lantern down on the dusty table and began to work. There was no grand plan. I just needed to do something, to fight back against the decay. I started with the trash. I filled one of the heavy-duty bags with spoiled food, rotted fabric, and worthless, broken junk. Then another, and another. The physical labor was a relief, a way to channel the turmoil inside me into something productive. It warmed me up, and it cleared a small space in the chaos. I decided to focus on the corner with the cot. If I was going to stay here, even for one night, I needed a clean, defensible space. I dragged the rotted mattress outside, leaving it for the wind and the snow. The metal cot frame was salvageable. I swept the floor around it, the bristles of the broom raising a choking cloud of dust. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven. As I swept near the heavy workbench, the broom snagged on something. I knelt, holding the lantern closer. It was a metal ring, flush with the concrete, almost completely obscured by dirt and grime. It was attached to a section of the floor that looked different, darker. I swept the area more thoroughly. Beneath the workbench, hidden in the perpetual shadow, was a rectangle of concrete about 3 feet by 4 feet. It had a different texture from the surrounding floor, and set into one edge was the small, recessed metal ring. My heart started to beat a little faster. It looked like a trap door, but the workbench was directly on top of it. It was a massive thing, made of thick timber and steel, and it was bolted to the floor. There was no way I could move it. I spent an hour trying, pushing and pulling until my muscles screamed and sweat was running down my back, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been put there specifically to hide whatever was underneath. Defeated, I sat back on my heels, breathing hard. Maybe it was nothing. A septic tank access, a water cistern. But my grandfather had been a carpenter, a man who built things to last. The placement felt deliberate, too deliberate. My eyes scanned the workbench again, the clutter of rusted tools, the thick layer of dust, and then I saw it. On the wall behind the bench, almost hidden by a cobweb, was a small, hand-painted diagram. It was faded and barely legible, but it showed the workbench, and next to it, an arrow pointing down and a series of numbers. It looked like a combination, but it wasn't for a safe. It was for the bench itself. I studied the diagram. It showed 4 bolts holding the bench to the floor. But one of the bolt heads in the drawing was different. It had a small notch depicted on it. I scrambled back to the bench, holding the lantern high. I examined the bolts at its base. They were huge, industrial-grade bolts, their heads caked in rust. But one of them, the one in the back left corner, looked different. I scraped at it with the tip of the pry bar. Underneath the rust, the head wasn't a standard hex bolt. It had a square indentation in the center. It was a release mechanism. My hands were shaking now. I looked around the cluttered bench top, searching for a tool that would fit. After a few minutes of frantic searching, I found it, lying amongst a pile of rusted wrenches. It was a custom-made tool, a T-handle with a square head that matched the bolt perfectly. It was a key. I inserted the key into the bolt head. It fit perfectly. I took a deep breath and turned it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, deep clunk that seemed to come from inside the concrete itself, I felt something disengage. I pulled on the bench, and this time, it moved. It didn't lift. It slid. The entire massive workbench, all several hundred pounds of it, rolled smoothly to the side on hidden casters, revealing the complete outline of the concrete trapdoor. My breath caught in my throat. It was real. He had built this. He had hidden this. And he had left a key, disguised as a tool, and a map, disguised as a doodle, for someone to find. For me to find. I knelt beside the trapdoor. The metal ring felt cold and solid in my hand. With a grunt of effort, I pulled. The heavy concrete slab lifted on a hidden, counterweighted hinge, swinging upward with surprising ease. It opened onto a flight of steep wooden steps, leading down into absolute, impenetrable blackness. A wave of cold, subterranean air washed over my face, carrying a scent that was entirely different from the hut above. It smelled of dry concrete, old paper, and time. I held the lantern over the opening. The light fell down the stairs, revealing a small, square room about 10 feet below. It was a bunker, a hidden chamber beneath the floor of a worthless Quonset hut in the middle of nowhere. My grandfather hadn't just left me a ruin, he had left me a secret. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I descended the wooden steps. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound swallowed by the confined space. The lantern cast flickering shadows on the smooth, poured concrete walls. The air grew colder, but it was a dry, still cold, utterly different from the damp chill of the hut above. This place had been sealed. The room at the bottom was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. It was meticulously organized. Against one wall stood a simple steel-framed desk and a wooden chair. On the desk sat a manual typewriter, a neat stack of paper beside it, and a single, heavy-looking metal box, like an old army surplus ammunition can. A set of shelves on the opposite wall held dozens of books, their spines straight and uniform. They were mostly history, politics, and law. This wasn't a fallout shelter or a storage cellar. It was an office, a secret study. It was my grandfather's real space. The chaos upstairs was a decoy. This was the place where he had spent his time. I set the lantern on the desk, its golden light filling the small room. There was no dust down here. The air was clean, preserved. It felt like I had stepped back in time, into a moment that had been frozen for 12 years. My eyes were drawn to the metal box on the desk. It was closed with a simple latch. There was a single yellowed envelope taped to the lid. On it, in a strong, slightly slanted handwriting, I recognized instantly from the one birthday card I ever got from him, was my name. Just Leo. My hand trembled as I reached out and took the envelope. I sat down in the wooden chair, the same chair he must have sat in countless times. The wood was cold and hard. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. I unfolded it. The letter began without preamble. Leo, if you are reading this, then you are smarter and more stubborn than I gave you credit for. And I am gone. I hope you will find it in your heart to forgive an old man for the silence. I know what they told you, that I abandoned you. It is a simple story, and in many ways, it was the necessary one. The truth is more complicated. The truth is, I did not abandon you, son. I hid you. I had to stop and read that line again. I did not abandon you. I hid you. The words seemed to lift a weight I didn't even know I was carrying. The cold, hard knot of resentment in my chest for the past 12 years began to ache, to soften. I read on, my eyes blurring with tears I refused to let fall. Your parents, my son and his wife, were not killed in a simple car accident. That was the official story, the one I helped create. They were investigative journalists. They were working on a story, a big one, about a consortium of powerful men involved in illegal land grabs and political corruption right here in this state. They were getting too close. The accident was a message, to them and to me. They came to me after it happened, the men your parents were investigating. They made it clear that my silence was not enough. They knew about you. You were 6 years old. They saw you as leverage, a loose end. They told me that if I kept you, if I raised you, you would always be a target. They would always be watching. But they offered me a deal. If I gave you up, if I cut all ties and let you disappear into the state system, they would leave you alone. You would be just another number, another file in a cabinet, anonymous, safe. I stopped reading, my head spinning. A car accident. That's all I'd ever been told. A tragic, random event. But it wasn't random. It was a murder. And my grandfather, he hadn't thrown me away. He had made an impossible choice. He had sacrificed his relationship with me, his only family, to keep me alive. He had let me hate him so that I could live. I put my head in my hands, and for the first time since I was a small child, I cried. I cried for the parents I never knew, murdered for telling the truth. I cried for the grandfather I had hated, who had borne that hatred as a shield to protect me. and I cried for the lonely, angry boy I had been, who had built his whole identity around a lie. It was a story of abandonment, but I had the characters wrong. I wasn't the one who had been abandoned. He was. After a few minutes, I wiped my face on my sleeve, my grief slowly hardening into a cold, sharp anger. I picked up the letter again. I took the deal. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. I watched them drive you away, and it broke what was left of my heart. I came out here, to this piece of worthless land, to be left alone. I built this place, this room, to work. I never stopped investigating. I spent the last decade of my life finishing what your parents started. All the evidence is in the box. Their notes, my findings, copies of documents, recorded conversations, everything. The company that calls itself Apex Development is the public face of the same corrupt network that killed your parents. They want this land, Leo. They want it because they are terrified of what might be buried here. And now, you have a choice. A choice I never wanted you to have to make. In the bottom of the box, you will find a false bottom. Beneath it is all the money I saved over the years. It's not a fortune, but it's enough. Nearly $50,000. It is your escape. You can take that money, walk away from this place, and never look back. Disappear. Live a full, happy life. That is what your parents would have wanted. It is what I want for you. No one would blame you. Or, you can stay. You can use what's in this box to fight, to finish the work. The evidence is enough to expose them, but it won't be easy. They are powerful, and they are ruthless. They will come for you. If you choose to fight, you will not be alone. There are names in the box. People I trusted. A lawyer in Cheyenne. A journalist in Denver. They don't know about you, but they will know my name. This is a burden I never meant to pass to you. The choice is yours, and yours alone. Run and live, or stay and fight. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you. I have always loved you. Your grandfather, Arthur. I let the letter fall from my fingers. The small concrete room felt like the center of the universe. $50,000, a new life. I could be anyone, anywhere. I could go to college. I could travel. I could forget Carbon County, Apex Development, and the ghosts of my family. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card for my entire life. All I had to do was take it and run. It was the smart choice, the sane choice. I opened the heavy metal box. It was filled with files, cassette tapes, and notebooks, all meticulously labeled. It was a decade of my grandfather's life, a decade of obsession and grief and quiet, relentless work. I lifted the top layer of files. Just as the letter said, there was a false bottom. I pried it up, and there it was, stacks of cash, bundled in rubber bands. It looked like more money than I had ever imagined. It was freedom, right there, in a box. I reached out and touched it. The paper felt crisp, real. I could just take it. I could walk out of the bunker, leave the hut to rot, and be on a bus to somewhere warm by morning. I could honor my grandfather's wish for me to be safe. But as I looked at the money, I didn't feel relief. I felt nothing. It was just paper. Then I looked at the files, at the names of my parents on the labels, at the years of my grandfather's life condensed into ink and magnetic tape. That felt real. That felt heavy. He didn't just leave me money. He left me a story, my story, and he left me a choice. For 12 years, my life had been decided for me. I was a ward of the state. I was an orphan. I was a problem to be managed. Now, for the first time, I had a choice that mattered, a choice that would define who I was. Not the boy who was abandoned, but the man who would decide what to do next. I closed the lid on the money. I picked up one of the files. The label read, Apex Development, Land Fraud, Initial Investigation, J&S Vance, my parents' initials. I opened it, and I began to read. The hours that followed are a blur. I sat in that cold concrete room, the lantern hissing softly, and I read. I read my parents' notes, their handwriting a mix of professional shorthand and excited scribbles. I saw their minds at work, connecting names, dates, and shell corporations. They were brilliant, and they were fearless. They were chasing a story about how Apex Development was using extortion and legal loopholes to force ranchers off their land that was rich in untapped mineral rights. They were building a web, and they were close to trapping the spider at its center, a powerful state politician. Then, the notes stopped abruptly. The next file was my grandfather's. His handwriting was slower, more methodical. He picked up their trail, but he worked in the shadows, slowly, patiently, for a decade. He documented everything. Illegal water diversions, forged environmental reports, witness intimidation. He had cassette tapes of conversations with frightened locals who had been threatened. He had copies of bank transfers between Apex and offshore accounts. He had built a fortress of facts, an undeniable case. He hadn't just been hiding out here, mourning. He had been forging a weapon. As I read, the world outside the bunker ceased to exist. The cold, the wind, my own hunger, it all faded away. I was consumed by the story in those files. It was a story of greed and murder, but it was also a story of incredible courage. The courage of my parents and the quiet, stubborn resilience of my grandfather. He had sacrificed everything, not for revenge, but for justice. And now, that legacy, that weapon, was in my hands. What do you do when you discover your whole life is built on a secret? When the story you told yourself to survive turns out to be a lie designed to protect you. It's a profound shock to the system. If you've ever had a moment like that, a moment where the ground beneath your feet just vanished, let me know in the comments below. How did you handle it? Did it break you, or did it make you stronger? For me, sitting in that bunker, I felt like I was breaking and being rebuilt all at once. The boy who walked into that Quonset hut was angry and alone, convinced he was worthless. But the person reading those files was someone else. He was the son of heroes. He was the grandson of a quiet warrior. He was the keeper of a truth that could bring down powerful men. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. The letter was clear. They were ruthless. But the fear was now mixed with something else. A burning sense of purpose. A feeling I had never known before. My choice had already been made. I knew it the moment I closed the lid on the money and opened the first file. Running wasn't an option. Not anymore. My grandfather gave me a choice, but in showing me the truth, he had shown me there was only one path I could live with. I couldn't let their sacrifice be for nothing. I couldn't let his decade of lonely work rot in a hole in the ground. I finally emerged from the bunker as the first hints of dawn were painting the eastern sky a pale, fragile gray. I felt like I had been underground for a lifetime. The air in the hut was frigid, but it felt good to breathe. I was exhausted, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. I knew what I had to do. I made a fire in the old wood stove, using splintered boards from a broken crate. The warmth was tentative at first, but it slowly pushed back the worst of the chill. As the fire crackled to life, I made a plan. It was simple, almost laughably so. Step 1. Survive. Step 2. Fight. I used some of the cash from the box. It felt strange, like spending evidence, and walked the 2 miles back into town. Dale was opening the hardware store. He saw me and raised an eyebrow. "Still here, I see." "I'm staying," I said, and the words felt solid, real. "I need to make the place livable. Insulation, a new stovepipe, some plywood for the roof." Dale looked me over. He must have seen a change in me. The desperate, lost look was gone, replaced by a grim determination. He nodded slowly. "All right, son, let's get you sorted." I spent the next few days working on the hut. It was brutal, exhausting work. I patched the roof, insulated the walls, and installed a new, safer stovepipe. I cleaned out the decades of junk. With every piece of trash I threw out, with every nail I hammered, I felt like I was reclaiming the space. I wasn't just fixing a building. I was building a home, a base of operations. The locals watched me with a reserved curiosity. I bought groceries. I got coffee at the diner. I didn't say much, and they didn't ask. But I could feel a subtle shift. I wasn't just the crazy kid staying in the wreck anymore. I was the kid who was staying. About a week after I arrived, a shiny black SUV I didn't recognize rolled up the track to the hut. A man in an expensive suit and polished shoes got out, looking profoundly out of place against the backdrop of rust and sagebrush. He had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Leo Vance?" he asked, his voice smooth as oil. "My name is Mr. Corbin. I'm with Apex Development." I just stood there, my hands dirty from working on an engine block I'd found. I didn't say anything. "We were sorry to hear about your grandfather," he said, the sympathy ringing completely false. "I understand our offer to purchase this property was forwarded to you. I'm here today to tell you we're prepared to be more generous, given your circumstances." He made a show of looking around at the hut, a faint sneer on his lips. "This place, it's a liability. We're prepared to offer you $25,000. Cash. A fresh start. All you have to do is sign." 25,000. A month ago, that would have been a number so large as to be meaningless. Now, I knew what it was. It was hush money. It was the price they put on my silence. They knew I was here. They were testing me. I wiped my greasy hands on a rag, my eyes never leaving his. I thought about the files in the bunker beneath my feet. I thought about my parents. "The property isn't for sale," I said. Corbin's smile tightened. "Mr. Vance, let's be realistic. You're a kid with no resources. This land is worthless. The offer is more than fair. It's generous." I repeated, my voice low and even, "It's not for sale." For a moment, the mask dropped. I saw a flash of cold, reptilian anger in his eyes. He wasn't used to being told no. "You're making a serious mistake," he said, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "This offer won't be on the table forever. You should think very carefully about your next move." He got back in his SUV, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud. He sat there for a moment, looking at the hut, at me. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a threat. As the SUV drove away, kicking up a plume of dust, I knew the fight had begun. The first thing I did after Corbin left was go back down into the bunker. I found the list of names my grandfather had left. The first one was a lawyer, Elias Thorne, Cheyenne, young, hungry, hates bullies. I took $50,000 from the box, my grandfather's escape fund, and put it in my backpack. The rest of the money I left. I wasn't going to touch it. It felt wrong. But this portion, this was an investment in justice. The next morning, I caught the early bus to Cheyenne. The city felt huge and overwhelming after the quiet of the plains. I found the address for Thorne's law office. It was a small, second-floor walk-up over a bookstore. The sign on the door just said, E. Thorne, Attorney at Law. The office was cramped, filled with books and leaning towers of files. A young man who looked to be in his late 20s, with a shock of unruly hair and a tired but sharp look in his eyes, looked up from his desk. "Can I help you?" "Are you Elias Thorne?" I asked. "Depends who's asking," he said, leaning back in his chair. "My name is Leo Vance. My grandfather was Arthur Vance. He said you hate bullies." Thorne's expression changed. He sat up straighter. "Arthur Vance. I met him a few times. He consulted with me on a few pro bono cases. A good man. I was sorry to hear he passed." "He left me something," I said. I opened my backpack and took out one of the files, the top-level summary my grandfather had prepared. I put it on his desk. "He left me his work." Thorne opened the file. He started to read. I watched his face as he took it in. His casual demeanor fell away, replaced by a fierce, focused intensity. He read for 10 minutes without saying a word, his eyes scanning the pages. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. "This is dynamite," he breathed. I knew Arthur was looking into Apex, but I had no idea he had all this. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. "What do you want to do, Leo?" "I want to finish it," I said. I pushed the backpack across the desk. "This is a retainer. It's $50,000. Is it enough to start?" Thorne stared at the bag, then back at me. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen in days. "Enough?" he said, a laugh in his voice. "Kid, for a case like this? For a chance to burn these guys to the ground? I'd do it for free." He stood up and stuck out his hand. "Welcome aboard, Leo. Let's go give 'em hell." The drive back from Cheyenne with Elias was different. He drove an old, beaten-up pickup truck that rattled and shook, but it felt more solid than Corbin's silent SUV. We talked the whole way. I told him everything, about the bunker, the letters, my parents. He listened, his expression serious. "Your grandfather was a brave man," he said when I finished. "And your parents, too. You come from good stock, Leo." Coming from him, the words meant something. When we got back to the hut, I showed him the bunker. He spent hours down there, poring over the files, his excitement growing with every page. "He's got them, Leo," he said, his voice filled with awe. "He's got them on wire fraud, conspiracy, extortion. And with this evidence about your parents, maybe even murder one. This is a state and federal case. It's huge." The plan we formed was simple. Elias would use the evidence to file a massive civil suit against Apex and its partners. But more importantly, he would take the criminal evidence to the one person my grandfather had noted he might be able to trust, a young, ambitious assistant U.S. attorney in Denver. We would be fighting on two fronts, civil and criminal. In the weeks that followed, the Quonset hut became our war room. Elias would drive out from Cheyenne, his truck loaded with legal books and printer paper. We'd spend hours in the bunker, organizing the evidence, cross-referencing notes, and building our case. In between, I kept working on the hut. I installed a small solar panel array on the roof for power, giving me lights and the ability to charge a phone. I built real furniture out of reclaimed wood. The place started to look less like a ruin and more like a rustic, fortified cabin. It was my home. Life settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of work, the rhythm of a fight. I felt more alive than I ever had. The loneliness was gone, replaced by purpose. I wasn't just a boy anymore. I was a plaintiff. I was a witness. I was a part of something bigger than myself. The community, in its quiet, Western way, started to rally around me. Dale from the hardware store would accidentally give me discounts. The waitress at the diner would pack extra food for me, saying it was going to be thrown out anyway. One day, an old rancher, one of the men whose names I'd seen in my grandfather's files, showed up at my door. He didn't say much. He just handed me a box of fresh eggs and a slab of bacon. "Arthur was a good man," he said, his voice rough. "He tried to help us. We see you're trying to finish the job." It was a small gesture, but it felt enormous. I wasn't alone out here. My grandfather had planted seeds of trust all over this county, and now they were starting to grow. The pushback from Apex was swift and brutal. The day after Elias filed the lawsuit, the threats started. Not overt, like Corbin's visit, but insidious. My tires were slashed one night. A dead coyote was left on my doorstep. They were trying to scare me, to isolate me. They were trying to make me feel like a scared kid alone in the dark. But I wasn't. I had Elias, and I had the growing, unspoken support of the community. And most importantly, I had the truth, stored in a concrete room beneath my feet. Every time I felt a flicker of fear, I would go down into the bunker and read my father's notes or my grandfather's letters. Their courage became my courage. Their fight was now my fight. This wasn't just about land or money anymore. It was about family. It was about honor. It was about making sure that the name Vance stood for something more than just a tragic story. Months bled into a year. The legal battle was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Apex threw an army of expensive lawyers at us, filing motion after motion, trying to bankrupt us, to wear us down. But Elias was a bulldog. He fought them every step of the way, using my grandfather's meticulous research as a shield and a sword. The civil case was a stalemate, but the real action was happening behind the scenes. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver had taken the criminal case and run with it. A secret grand jury was convened. The witnesses my grandfather had found, now feeling protected, began to talk. The dam of fear he had spent a decade chipping away at was finally starting to break. I spent that year transforming the hut and myself. I learned to weld, to frame a wall, to read the weather in the clouds. The land that had seemed so hostile at first became familiar. I learned its rhythms, its secrets. I found the best places to watch the sunset, the ravines where the deer sheltered from the wind. The Quonset hut, once a symbol of everything I'd lost, was now my sanctuary. It was more than a home. It was a testament. Every repaired panel, every new shelf, was an act of defiance. It was me, putting down roots in the very place my enemies wanted to erase. The 50 acres weren't worthless. They were priceless. They held my history, my purpose, and my future. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elias's truck came rattling up the track faster than usual. He jumped out before the engine was even off, a wide, triumphant grin on his face. He was waving a newspaper. "We got them, Leo," he shouted, his voice echoing across the plains. "We got the bastards." The headline was stark. State Senator, Apex executives indicted in massive fraud and corruption probe. The story laid it all out. The land grabs, the extortion, the conspiracy. And at the end of the article, a small, carefully worded paragraph mentioned that the investigation had been reopened based on new evidence concerning the deaths of two journalists, Jonathan and Sarah Vance, 12 years prior. They didn't call it a murder investigation, not yet, but it was a start. It was more than a start. It was a victory. I took the newspaper from Elias, my hands shaking. I read the names of the men who had been arrested. The same names from my father's notes. The same names my grandfather had hunted for a decade. It was over. The fight wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The trials would take years, but the truth was out. The secrets were exposed. I looked around at the vast, open land stretching out to the horizon, at the solid, rebuilt hut that was my home. I thought about the boy who had arrived here a year ago, full of anger and despair, with nothing but a cardboard box and a story of being abandoned. He was gone. In his place was a man who knew where he came from, and who had chosen what he would stand for. My inheritance wasn't the land, or the money, or even the bunker full of secrets. My real inheritance was the choice my grandfather gave me. The choice to be more than a victim. The choice to fight for the truth. He had given me back my family, and in doing so, he had given me back myself. That evening, I didn't celebrate. I walked out to a small rise overlooking the property, the same place I'd often seen my grandfather's old truck parked in the faded photos I'd found. The sun was setting, lighting the sky on fire. The wind was cold and clean. I thought about the question in my grandfather's letter: run and live, or stay and fight? I had chosen to stay and fight, but I realized now that in doing so, I had also learned how to live. I had a home. I had a purpose. I had a community. I had found my place in the world, not by running to a new one, but by reclaiming the one that was rightfully mine. The story doesn't end there, of course. Life is never that neat. The legal battles continued for years, a slow, grinding process of depositions and court dates. But the tide had turned. With the federal indictments, Apex Development crumbled, its assets frozen, its partners turning on each other. The civil suit Elias filed on behalf of myself and the other ranchers ended in a settlement that was, as he put it, biblical. It didn't bring back what people had lost, but it was a measure of justice. It was an acknowledgement that their homes and livelihoods had been stolen. The murder investigation into my parents' deaths was officially reopened. It's still ongoing. Maybe one day there will be a trial. Maybe not. But the truth is no longer a secret buried in a concrete bunker. It's a public record. And sometimes that's the only justice you get. I never touched the rest of the money in the bunker. I used the settlement money to pay off the back taxes for good and to set up a small legal defense fund, managed by Elias, to help other people in the county who were being bullied by powerful interests. It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like what my grandfather would have done. I stayed in the Quonset hut. It's my home. I expanded it, built a real workshop, planted a garden. It's no longer a monument to neglect. It's a testament to resilience. People in town don't look at me with pity anymore. They look at me with a kind of quiet respect. I'm not Arthur's abandoned grandkid. I'm Leo Vance. I belong here. Sometimes, late at night, I go down into the bunker. It's not a war room anymore. It's a library, a place of reflection. I read my grandfather's books. I look at my parents' notes. It's not a place of sadness. It's a place of strength. It's a reminder that the stories we are told about ourselves are not always the truth, and that sometimes the most valuable things in our lives are the things that other people tell us are worthless. This journey taught me something profound. It taught me that home isn't just a place you are given. It's a place you build, a place you defend, a place you make your own. And inheritance isn't just about money or property. It's about the stories we carry and the choices we make. It's about the legacy of courage we choose to honor. My grandfather left me a rusted-out hut and a terrible choice. But in doing so, he gave me the greatest gift of all, a chance to discover who I truly was. So I want to ask you, what does home mean to you? Is it a place, a person, a feeling? Have you ever had to fight for it? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, because I believe our stories are the most powerful things we have. They connect us, they strengthen us, and they remind us that we are not alone in our struggles. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, if you believe in the power of second chances and fighting for what's right, then please subscribe to the channel and join our community. We're all just trying to find our way home, and sometimes the journey starts in the most unexpected of places. Be well and be strong.